به وبینار زمان خوش آمدید. به شما بینندگان این وبینار و شرکت کنندگان آن، خانم‌ها فریدا، آفاری، یولیا یورچنکو و اوکسانا دوچاک سلام می‌کنم. عنوان این وبینار علیه سرکوب و جنگ، همبستگی زنان ایران و اوکراین است. این وبینار به گفتگوی فریدا آفاری با فمینیست‌های اوکراینی، خانم‌های یورچنکو و دوچاک اختصاص دارد. فریدا آفاری فمینیست و فعال اجتماعی، مترجم و نویسنده است. فریدا در لس آنجلس کتابدار است و در کتابخانه شهر کلاس‌هایی در زمینه فلسفه و سیاست برگزار می‌کند. از ایشان کتاب رویکردی نوین به فمینیسم سوسیالیستی به تازگی منتشر شده. یولیا یورچنکو مدرس ارشد و پژوهشگر در رشته اقتصاد سیاسی در دانشگاه گرینیچ است. اوکسانا دوچاک یکی از دبیران ژورنال اشپیلنه و دارای درجه دکترای علوم اجتماعی است. وبینار به زبان انگلیسی برگزار می شود و چکیده بحث را خانم آفاری به فارسی ترجمه می کنند. خانم آفاری همچنین برگزار کننده این جلسه هستند. خانم آفاری بفرمایید.
متشکرم و سلام میگم به بینندگان زمانه و به سخنرانان. من نخست مقدمه رو به فارسی میخونم و بعد به انگلیسی و سخنرانان رو به زبان انگلیسی معرفی میکنم. بعد هر سوال رو اول به فارسی میخونم و به انگلیسی سخنرانان پاسخ میدن، پاسخاشون رو ترجمه میکنم و بعد میرم سراغ سوال بعدی. اخیرا جمعی از فمینیست های اوکراینی بیانیه‌ای را به منظور ابراز همبستگی خود با خیزش مردم ایران و خصوصا مبارزات زنان ایران منتشر کردند. در این بیانیه که توسط بیش از 100 کنشگر و نویسنده و سازمان طیف چپ امضا شده است، خواسته های تظاهر کنندگان ایرانی مبنی بر دموکراسی، عدالت اجتماعی، حق اختیار زن بر بدن خود و مبارزه علیه خشونت دولتی و خانگی برجسته شده است. فعالان اوکراینی تاکید کردند که دولت ایران تنها به شهروندان خود ستم روا نمی‌کند، بلکه از دیگر رژیم‌های ستمگر و امپریالیستی در منطقه از جمله روسیه حمایت می‌کند. آنها نتیجه گرفتند که مبارزه مردم ایران برای آزادی با مبارزه برای آزادی و امنیت شهروندان عادی اوکراینی گره خورده است. این تلاش فعالان عدالتخواه اوکراینی برای دراز کردن دست همبستگی به سوی تظاهر کنندگان ایرانی نیازمند پاسخ است. اکنون روسیه در ازای دریافت پهپاد و موشک از ایران سطح بی‌سابقه از حمایت نظامی و فنی را به تهران ارائه می‌کند. ارتش روسیه توانسته با کمک پهپادها و موشک‌های بالیستیکی که از ایران دریافت کرده، زیرساختار بسیاری از شهرهای اوکراین را نابود و مردم عادی را از آب و برق و آذوقه محروم کند. فمینیست برجسته ایرانی نسرین ستوده در سال گذشته پس از شروع حمله نظامی روسیه به اوکراین فوراً این حمله را محکوم کرد و در نامه‌ای سرگشاده به دبیر کل سازمان ملل نوشت: من نیز مثل میلیون‌ها انسان در سراسر جهان از این تجاوز گستاخانه وحشت زده‌ام و در همبستگی با مردم اوکراین و ایستادن در کنار آنها اظهار می‌دارم که صلح جهانی بدون ایستادگی در مقابل تجاوز نظامی روسیه و حمایت از اوکراین بی‌معناست. حال پای گفتگو با دو فمینیست اوکراینی می نشینیم و می پرسیم که چگونه می توان بین مبارزات مردم ایران و اوکراین و خصوصا مبارزات زنان همبستگی برقرار کرد. Hello, my name is Farida Afari. I am an Iranian American librarian, translator, and author of Socialist Feminism: A New Approach. I would like to welcome you to this bilingual زمان dialogue between Ukrainian and Iranian feminists. Last November, a group of Ukrainian feminists issued a statement in solidarity with the popular uprising in Iran, and especially the struggles of Iranian women. In this statement, which was signed by over 100 activists, writers, and organizations from the left, the demands of Iranian protesters for democracy, social justice, the right of women to control their own body, and the struggle against state and domestic violence have been highlighted. Ukrainian activists have emphasized that the Iranian government does not only oppress its citizens, it also provides support for other oppressive and imperialist regimes in the region, including Russia. They have concluded that the struggles of the people of Iran for liberation are tied to the struggles of ordinary Ukrainians for freedom and security. This effort by justice-seeking Ukrainians to reach out in solidarity to Iranian protesters demands a response. Currently, Russia is receiving drones and missiles from Iran in exchange for giving an unprecedented level of military and technical support to Iran. With the help of Iranian drones and ballistic missiles, the Russian military has been able to destroy the infrastructure of many Ukrainian cities and deprive ordinary people of water, electricity, and food. Last year, after Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine, prominent Iranian feminist Nasrin Sotoudeh immediately condemned this invasion and wrote the following in an open letter to the Secretary General of the United Nations. Quote, "Like millions of people around the world, I am horrified by this brutal invasion. In solidarity with the people of Ukraine and standing by them, I declare that world peace is meaningless without resistance against Russia's military invasion and defending Ukraine." Unquote. Now let's have a conversation with two Ukrainian feminists and find out how we can develop solidarity between the struggles of the people of Iran and Ukraine, and especially the women's struggles. Yulia Yurchenko is a senior lecturer and researcher in political economy at the University of Greenwich in the United Kingdom. Her research focuses on state, society, capital complexes, and transnational class formation, and the political economy of post-Soviet countries. She's the author of Ukraine and the Empire of Capital, From Marketization to Armed Conflict, published by Pluto Press in 2018. And she's also an editor for Capital and Class, among other journals. Oksana Dudchak is co-editor of the Ukrainian Shtilner or Commons Journal. She holds a PhD in social sciences and is currently continuing her academic work within the Berliner Institut für empirische Integrations- und Migrationsforschung. Her research interests include protest, workers' protest, gender inequality, social reproduction, care labor, Marxism, Marxist feminism. Oksana is devoted to engaged and public research, which contributes to public discussion and policies, trying to give voice to workers and other structurally underprivileged groups. Currently, she's a refugee in Germany with 2 kids and a dog. So I will be asking the questions first in Persian, then English, and our speakers will respond in English. I will translate and move on from there. So the first question I will read in Persian first. سوال نخست. نزدیک به 1 سال از شروع حمله نظامی تمام عیار روسیه به اوکراین می‌گذرد. در این مدت ارتش روسیه 10,000 اوکراینی را کشته و میلیون‌ها نفر از جمعیت 44 میلیونی این کشور را آواره یا پناهنده کرده است. کشتارهای جمعی و تجاوز نظاممند به زنان و مردان بخشی عمده از حمله نظامی روسیه بوده است. نقش زنان در مقاومت مردم اوکراین علیه حمله نظامی روسیه چه بوده است؟ فمینیست‌ها و فعالان مدافع اقلیت‌های جنسی در مقاومت اوکراین چه نقشی داشتند؟ همبستگی فمینیستی در سطح جهانی چگونه بوده است؟ چه موانعی در راه این همبستگی وجود داشته است؟ And here's the first question in English. Almost a year has passed since Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine. During this time, the Russian army has killed tens of thousands of Ukrainians and has caused the displacement of millions out of a population of 44 million, many of whom have become refugees. Mass murder and systematic rapes have been a major part of this invasion. What has been the role of women in the popular resistance of Ukrainians against Russia's invasion? What has been the role of feminists and sexual minorities in this resistance? How would you evaluate the global feminist solidarity, and what have been some barriers in this solidarity? Oksana, would you like to start?
Thank you, Frida. I'm really glad to be here, and thank you for organizing this important talk. I think we sometimes are too deep into our own problems and challenges, and it's important to have a look from the outside and try to pull the discussion further, which is extremely important, I think. I will start probably with more general picture that all of us understand and saw how the Russian invasion was accompanied not only by the very genocidal discourse on the side of Russian government, but also with a very patriarchal discourse, including presenting Ukraine like a female which should be submitted to the power of the more mighty country, meaning Russia. So in the end, it led also to resistance, not only in terms of national liberation struggle, but also the anti-patriarchal component of the struggle is important, and anti-conservative component of the struggle is important. Because we should understand and we should remember that when we are speaking about the Russian society and Russian regime, we are speaking about a very patriarchal regime. We should remember that, for example, domestic violence is decriminalized in Russia, and for example, that LGBT rights are very under heavy constraints in Russia, including like recently bans on different publications or any art pieces which represent how they frame it, which propagate LGBT. So in the end, I would say that the response of Ukrainian feminists and LGBT community, including organizations, groups, individuals, activists, was quite obvious, and it was not different from the response from the majority of the society, and it was about struggle against Russian invasion, struggle for self-determination of Ukrainian society, and struggle against all this very patriarchal, very conservative trends which we have been observing in Russia and which we don't want to see in Ukraine. I think we can start translating here and then I will continue.
That's a good spot. اوکسانا میگوید که حمله نظامی روسیه به اوکراین هم مبتنی بر یک گفتمان معطوف به نسل کشی بود، یعنی کشتن از بین بردن نسل اوکراینی ها، و هم مبتنی بر یک گفتمان بسیار مردسالار، و از این رو باعث شد که در اوکراین ما شاهد هم یه مبارزه برای رهایی ملی باشیم و هم یه مبارزه‌ای که بعد خیلی قوی ضد مردسالاری داره. و وقتی که ما در مورد جامعه روسیه صحبت میکنیم باید در نظر بگیریم که روسیه جامعه بسیار مردسالاریه که در اون خشونت خانگی از خشونت خانگی جرم زدایی شده و حمله به دگرباشان جنسی بسیار متداوله، حملات بسیار خشونتبار به دگرباشان جنسی و از این رو پاسخ فمینیست های اوکراینی و دگرباشان جنسی اوکراینی هم بعد از حمله نظامی روسیه به اوکراین بسیار مدافع مقاومت هماهنگ با بقیه مردم کشور بود و بنابراین هیچ اختلاف نظری در این زمینه وجود نداشت که باید علیه این حمله نظامی جنگید و جلوی این پیشرفت نیروهای ارتش روسیه رو گرفت، هم از لحاظ حق خودمختاری و استقلال اوکراینی ها و هم از لحاظ مبارزه با مردسالاری. Thank you, Oksana. Please move on.
Further, I will go to the participation of women, feminists, LGBT community in Ukrainian resistance. And of course, it takes a very multiple shapes, starting from one of the most probably widely discussed in terms of participation of women in military service and in army and in armed resistance, which is of course important, but there are also a lot of things which are maybe not that noticeable, but also still important. So women and feminists, including feminists and LGBT community organizations and groups, are also very actively involved in all the various kind of volunteering and humanitarian relief, including like providing, for example, LGBT community, LGBT organizations were providing shelters for LGBT people who were living the dangerous territories and trying to seek safety. They were assisting them in inside Ukraine and outside Ukraine and so on. Also organization of evacuation and providing people with a very basic humanitarian support, like including food, hygienic products, and so on. Also, women and feminists and LGBT community are very active in participating in different tasks, very multiple tasks, which are needed both for military resistance, including like technical things like creating different, we call it like masking nets, so nets which are needed for to cover and to hide military cars and different military machinery and so on, or providing frontline with special candles which can both provide light and heating in winter, and so on. Also, what is also important, like in Ukrainian society, as in many other society, the frontline workers or key workers, they are very much feminized labor force, like including, for example, healthcare sector. So their role in the context of war, of destruction of wounded people, and providing support, healthcare for these wounded people is also very prominent. And this, like healthcare workers, for example, they are predominantly women. Also, for those who are, especially for those who are outside, but also inside, an important part of involvement is raising political issues and like raising the voice of Ukrainian society and participating in different spaces and in different forms to voice the resistance, to give the voice to it, and to campaign for different issues and against different challenges which are very important now. For example, groups I am related to, progressive groups, they are campaigning for cancellation of Ukrainian debt, because in the context of war, economic crisis, of course, this debt is impossible to pay, and being problematic in itself. Now it's like the context is that this issue is even more pressing, the issue of debt cancellation. Yeah, I think I will stop here on the involvement.
Thank you. اوکسانا میگوید که حضور زنان، فمینیست ها و جامعه دیگرباشان جنسی در مقاومت علیه حمله نظامی روسیه گونه های متفاوتی داشته، از جمله شرکت زنان در خدمات نظامی و مقاومت نظامی و علاوه بر اون شرکت فعالانه در خدماتی از جمله ارائه آذوقه و کمک به تخلیه جمعیت از مناطقی که مورد حمله شدید قرار گرفته، خدمات انسان دوستانه و حتی کارهای فنی، کارهای یا کارهای که معمولاً کارهای زنانه شمرده میشن، از جمله فرض کنیم خیاطی یا بافتن تور برای نیازهای جنگی و یا تهیه شمع‌هایی که هم نور میده و هم گرما ایجاد میکنه. و در مجموع کسانی که کارکنان خط مقدم جبهه شمرده میشن عمدتاً زنن. مراقبت از افرادی که مجروح شدن عمدتاً به عهده زنانه و زنان همچنین نقش خیلی مهمی داشتن در بحث‌های سیاسی و به گوش جهان رساندن صدای اوکراینی ها، شرکت در گفتگوها، کارزارها، از جمله کارزارهای بین‌المللی، از جمله کارزاری برای باطل کردن وام اوکراین در شرایط کنونی که بسیار ورشکسته است و قابلیت پرداخت وامش نداره. Thank you.
And finally, on the question of international solidarity, feminist solidarity, I won't tell much here, but I would stress it was and it has been uneven. So we have seen a very bad examples of mostly Western feminists taking the public space and pushing the message which we do not support, and without including any voice from the ground, which is, as I perceive it, in the very against the very basic principles of feminism, basically. So that was one part of the story, and we tried to counter this kind of tendency by authoring the collective document which was called The Right to Resistance, a feminist manifesto, and which was created by a collective of Ukrainian feminists and signed by many people and organizations from Ukraine and abroad. Like now the total number of signatures is up to 1,000. And but on the other hand, we have seen also a lot of solidarity and support from progressive feminist movement, both from Europe, from US, from all the other countries, including like from the region, like from Poland and so on and so forth. So I think it was uneven. As for barriers for this kind and or reasons for these tendencies, which we sometimes didn't like a lot, like I think it's quite a separate discussion, but I think in the core of this problem is probably the historical conditions, first of all, like the decline or some kind of stagnation of progressive movement globally, and lack of progressive project in terms of country or in terms of movement on the global scale. And it all leads to kind of demobilization of the movement and all this quite warring tendencies which we have been observing. And I also think one of the problem which I encounter very often is also the like very idealistic perception of situation, lack of knowledge, lack of willing to know. Like people don't want to get into context, history, and to hear the voices from the ground. And it's a very bad, it leads to very bad conclusions, and which we cannot accept.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. در مورد همبستگی فمینیستی، همبستگی که ابراز شده در واقع میشه گفت ناهمگون بوده. یعنی از یک سو یه بخشی از فمینیستای نامدار بیانیه صادر کردن تحت نام مخالفت با جنگ، ولی در واقع نیاز به همبستگی با مبارزه و مقاومت اوکراین رو رد کردن و به هیچ وجه سعی نکردن که با فمینیستای اوکراینی در این مورد مشورت کنن و اون بیانیه هیچ امضا کننده اوکراینی هم نداشت. و از این رو فمینیستای اوکراینی بیانیه خودشون رو صادر کردن تحت عنوان حق مقاومت و پاسخ دادن به بیانیه فمینیستای نامدار که در ماه مارس منتشر شده بود. و این بیانیه فمینیستای اوکراینی امضا کنندگان و هم افراد و هم سازمان‌های بسیاری داره جزء امضا کنندگانش. از سوی دیگر همبستگی و همراهی با مقاومت مردم اوکراین از سوی بخش دیگری از فمینیستا و فعالان اجتماعی در اروپا و اروپای شرقی و کشورهای دیگه بسیار قابل توجه بوده و بنابراین همین واژه ناهمگون رو استفاده میکنه برای تعریف نوع پاسخی که داده شده به از جهت همبستگی فمینیستی. و علاوه بر این اوکسانا تاکید میکنه که ما کلاً با یک شرایط افول و پسرفت پروژه‌های ترقیخواه در جهان روبروییم و این پاسخ ناهمگونی هم که میبینیم به اوکراین داده شده و یا مقاومت مردم اوکراین، این هم خودش نمود چنین پسرفت و افول در سطح جهانیه و فکر میکنه که این ریشه داره در یک برخورد دید خیلی غیر واقعی از شرایط، که دیدی که نمیخواد فکت ها رو به رسمیت بشناسه و در واقع همین درک درستی از فکت ها و امر واقع نداره. Thank you, Oksana. Please move on.
Should I go with the second question? Because I'm done with the first one.
Let me go to the second question. Julia, would you like to say anything about the first question? Go ahead, please.
Thank you very much, and thank you for having us here, and thank you, Oksana, for this comprehensive overview of these complicated and complex matters. I wanted to add a couple of words on where solidarity comes from and what the challenges are, and what some of the things that we need to be doing about it are. So we've seen with some of these letters that you mentioned at the beginning that some of those global feminist solidarity expressions indeed reproduced imperial gaze problems and were speaking for Ukrainian people, even though that's not what Ukrainian people wanted, that's not what Ukrainian women wanted. Those narratives and letters were rather abstract and deaf to Ukrainian struggle, projecting own agendas and vacuous pacifist calls. Because what we need to understand as activists, as feminists, is that material conditions always matter, and that everybody has a right to self-defense. And Ukrainian and Russian feminists have been united on it, as Oksana already said. International solidarity has been mixed indeed And we have seen in Eastern European groups, for example, more solidarity, and in Syrian and Iranian feminists, more solidarity than in some West European and North American countries. But again, the terrain is uneven. But we've seen a lot of support helping women with childcare and housing and access to abortion, especially in places like Poland, for example, where it's very difficult. We've seen support with getting counseling and housing, and very often that support came from average women who do not associate with any movements, and who do not reside, let alone those who reside in powers, in the ivory towers of academia, who sometimes, it seems to me, worry more about their image and egos and the sanctity of their theories, rather than material needs of sisters around the world. So average women were coordinating, gathering food and clothes, home abortion kits, providing free therapy, helping fill the documents for refugees, helping them with housing, helping them with childcare, providing free language classes. All of those things came from those who sometimes won't even call themselves feminists. And that makes us wonder about the divide of academic and mainstream feminist discourses in some Western countries, and the material needs of women, children, those vulnerable LGBTQI groups around the world, and the future of feminist thought and feminist activism, and how important it is to center the needs of those suffering before somebody's analytical needs or academic egos. I'll bring one example here. There's been a rapid rise in human trafficking with the beginning of this war, and a lot of women and children ended up being prostituted around Europe, and some of them fell through the cracks, and it will be a long time till we find any trace of them. And especially when they end up in countries with legalized sex trade, and countries where social protections are also needed, the ability of campaigners to support victims of trafficking, to their ability to seek justice and prosecution of those who perpetrate trafficking, are watered down. And of course, the liberal arguments about choice are absolutely redundant here. And it also, there are material conditions of people running away from the war with limited needs, not having enough protections, being exploited, that basically expose the inability of certain systems to safeguard, protect, and prosecute those who are exploiting those vulnerable people. That is also something that I think brings up the gaps of intersectional critique and lack of intersectional critique of the situations where power disbalances, economic, legal, and otherwise, are rife. There are a lot of barriers that exist to build solidarity of better-to-do women and feminists, overall feminist groups and academics. And some of those barriers are specifically in that lack of materialist intersectional critique of patriarchal, racialized, ecocidal capitalism. And thus the meaning of solidaristic vision is lacking as well, if you do not understand the power imbalances and the meaninglessness of choice in a situation of dire economic need. And from that, with the lack of that critique, there is a lack of understanding of material needs and rather primacy of vacuous academic thinking. We see that there is a lack of understanding of where those needs are, and lack of program for help, while also unwillingness to hear those who are asking for help. So I think decolonization of vision and prioritization, the voices and the needs of those who are most vulnerable is what needs to happen for solidarities to be built. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate that response as well. یولیا یورچنکو میگوید که اون چی که ما در بیانیه بخشی از فمینیستای نامدار در پاسخ به حمله نظامی روسیه به اوکراین دیدیم در ماه مارس، نمونه رویکرد امپریالیستی بود، رویکردی بسیار انتزاعی تحت نام دفاع از ایده صلح و صلح باوری. واقعیت امر این است که مردم اوکراین مانند مردم هر کشور دیگری حق دفاع از خود رو در برابر حمله نظامی دارند. حمایت جهانی که ما دریافت کردیم بیشتر از کشورهای زنان و فمینیستای کشورهای اروپای شرقی بوده و همچنین از سوی فعالان سوری و برخی فعالان ایرانی حمایت دریافت کردیم، در دست کم حمایت لفظی، و میتونیم بگیم کمتر از آمریکا و اروپای غربی، منظور فمینیستای این کشور است. خصوصا در لهستان به زنان پناهجو کمک شده که برای مراقبت از فرزندانشون کمک بگیرن، حتی برای سقط جنین، با وجود اینکه سقط جنین در لهستان غیرقانونی محسوب میشه. و جالبه که این زنان عادی بودن که بیشتر به ما کمک کردن، نه زنان نامدار فمینیست. و متاسفانه به نظر میاد که زنان نامدار فمینیست در برج‌های عاج آکادمیک خودشون محصورن و بیشتر به ایده های انتزاعی و جلوه‌ای که از خودشون ابراز میکنن اهمیت میدن تا نیازهای روزمره زنان عادی. و این سوال مطرح میشه که پس شاید یک شکاف عظیم وجود داره بین فمینیست های آکادمیک و دانشگاهی و نیازهای زنان عادی. برای مثال موضوع قاچاق زنان، از جمله بسیار زنانی که به عنوان پناهجو به اروپای شرقی آمدن و حالا گرفتار قاچاقچیان سرمرز شدن، این موضوع و پاسخی که از سوی فمینیست‌ها یا عدم پاسخی که از سوی فمینیست‌های نامدار می‌بینیم، با در نظر گرفتن این که قاچاق رو بودن این زنان و بردن آنها به کشورهایی که در اون هیچ حقوق اعمال نمیشه، به این معنی که دیگه ما تا ابد این زنها رو گم کردیم. و این عدم پاسخی که از سوی فمینیستای نامدار میبینیم، یا این گفتمان مبتنی بر حق انتخاب وقتی صحبت از تن فروشی میشه، گفتمانی که در میان برخی از فمینیستای جهانی متداول شده در مورد حق انتخاب تن فروشی، این واقعا بی‌معنیه. یعنی در نظر نمیگیره که ما با زنان بسیار آسیب پذیری روبرویم که مورد سوء استفاده و استثمار قرار گرفتن. و به نظر یولیا این نمایانگر فقدان یک رویکرد مبتنی بر در همتنیدگی ستم هاست که و نمایانگر عدم درک شرایط مادی و عینی یه سرمایه‌داری مبتنی بر پدرسالاری و مردسالاری، عدم درک شرایط مادی و جایگزین کردن این فقدان با گفتمانی بی‌معنی در مورد حق انتخاب. و بسیار نگرانه که نتایج و تبعات این شکاف چه خواهد شد. اولین قدمی که میتونیم برداریم اینه که اولویت رو بدیم به نیازهای زنان عادی و شرایط مادی کنونی و اون رو به رسمیت بشناسیم. Thank you, Yulia. So now I will go to the second question, which I will read in Persian first and then in English. حال میریم به سوال دوم. شما در بیانیه فمینیست‌های اوکراینی در همبستگی با خیزش کنیم در ایران گفته اید که مبارزه مردم ایران برای آزادی با مبارزه برای آزادی و امنیت شهروندان عادی اوکراینی گره خورده است. ما به این امر واقفیم که اکنون روسیه در ازای دریافت پهپاد و موشک از ایران سطح بی‌سابقه از حمایت نظامی و فنی را به تهران ارائه می‌کند. ارتش روسیه توانسته با کمک پهپادها و موشک‌های بالیستیک که از ایران دریافت کرده زیرساختار بسیاری از شهرهای اوکراین را نابود و مردم عادی را از آب و برق و آذوقه محروم کند. لطفاً بیشتر در این مورد و همبستگی مورد نیاز از سوی مردم ایران صحبت کنید. Second question is the following. In your feminist statement of solidarity with the current uprising in Iran, you have stated that the Iranian people's struggle for freedom is tied to the Ukrainian people's struggle for freedom and security. We are aware that Russia is getting drones and missiles from Iran and offering Iran an unprecedented level of military and technical support instead. With the help of the drones and ballistic missiles from Iran, the Russian army has been able to destroy the infrastructure of many Ukrainian cities and has deprived ordinary people of water, power, and food. Please tell us more about this and the needed solidarity from the people of Iran. Either one, Yulia or Oksana, whoever would like to lead that.
I can start. I'll do a brief one. It's a very important question for all of us to consider, and indeed, the question of one of the things that I wonder is, in this question, when you ask about solidarity from people from Iran, it is difficult to consider asking the people who are fighting such important fights in such difficult conditions with such zeal to also try to help you. But there are certain things that I think Iranians and Ukrainians could ask Iranians to do, and some of those things could be compromising the supplies of those weapons, compromising the productive capacity of Iran to manufacture those weapons, compromising the supply lines. Because indeed, the fight against Russia and Iran it is a one fight, because those dictatorial alliances must fall. They keep supporting each other internationally and weakening not only the solidarity of people fighting this fight around the world, but also destroying the ability of their populations together to fight back, and thus increasing the rise of authoritarianism, of fascism around the world. Those drones that Iran supplies to Russia allow Russia to advance in warfare and terrorize Ukrainian population. A lot of them are kamikaze drones, means that they do not need to be manned, and indeed we have seen dozens and hundreds of them being launched against Ukrainian cities, as you already mentioned, destroying infrastructure, destroying water supplies. But one of the main targets and tasks of these drone attacks is to terrorize Ukrainian population into submission, and that is and to show Ukrainians that no place in the country is safe, that you cannot move anywhere within the country and feel safe there, and in that regard, of course, these supplies need to stop. On top of the military supplies, Iran is also sharing experience, if you like, with Russia on how to avoid oil sanctions, so as to undermine the ability of different sanction packages to compromise Russia's economic capacity to fund the war. So it's very important for us to forge a collective front and a narrative that Ukraine and Iran are fighting the same fight, that with the fall of Putin via defeat in this war, Iran's regime will also weaken, so that these murderous alliances that rely on each other will fall, and therefore Iranian people can be emancipated sooner. I've seen some tropes in North American left that calls itself left, that Iranian resistance, for example, is somehow CIA funded to undermine Iranian regime. There are all these crazy narratives going around, and we need to challenge them, because there is a very important fight, a very courageous fight that Iranian people are fighting. And it is not dissimilar to what Ukrainian people are fighting against Putin in Ukraine. And Iranian population is terrorized at home, while Ukrainian population is terrorized by Iranian regime via Russia at home. And in that sense, this fight is won. But so I will stop at that. Thank you.
Thank you. یولیا یورچنکو میگوید که برای من کاملا قابل فهمه که در شرایطی که مردم ایران سخت در حال مبارزن علیه رژیم خودشون، مبارزه بسیار تحسین آمیز، ما از اونا بخوایم که در این حال از مبارزه اوکراین هم حمایت کنن. اما کاری که مردم ایران میتونن انجام بدن در این است که در حین مبارزه علیه رژیمشون مسئله حمایت روسیه، حمایت ایران از روسیه رو مطرح کنن و سعی کنن مقابله کنن با این ارسال پهپادها و موشک‌ها به روسیه و این زنجیره رو بشکنن. و چون واقعیت امر اینه که این همبستگی‌های قدرت‌های مستبد جهان، قدرت‌های اقتدارگرا، این اتحادها نه فقط به کشورهایی صدمه میزنن که مورد حمله امپریالیستی قرار گرفتن، به مردم خود اون کشورها هم صدمه میزنن و مقاومت درون خود اون کشورها رو ضعیف میکنن. این پهپادهایی که ایران به روسیه میفروشه پهپادهایی هستند که هدفشون حمله تروریستی به کل جمعیت اوکراینه و بسیار ویرانگرن. یک راه دیگری که ایران به روسیه کمک کرده این بوده که به روسیه نشون داده که چطور تحریم‌های نفت روسیه رو دور بزنه و از این طریق هم اگر مردم ایران با این هم مقابله کنن و اجازه ندن که دولت ایران به روسیه کمک کنه که تحریم‌های نفتش رو دور بزنه، این هم کمک بسیار مهمی خواهد بود به مبارزه مردم اوکراین و در واقع مبارزه مردم اوکراین و مبارزه مردم ایران به هم گره خوردن و اگر که دولت پوتین ساقط بشه دولت ایران هم بسیار ضعیفتر خواهد شد. و در پایان یولیا گفت که ما باید مقابله کنیم با این تبلیغات برخی از متاسفانه برخی از چپی‌های غربی که حتی به مقاومت مردمی داخل ایران علیه جمهوری اسلامی برچسب حمایت از CIA و امثال هم میزنن و باید از هر طریقی که امکان پذیر باشه برامون به جهانیان بگیم که مبارزات مردم اوکراین و مبارزات مردم ایران به هم گره خوردن. Thank you. Oksana, would you like to respond to that question?
I will add briefly, thank you. First of all, I mean, I think what Julia has told us, it's like the main highlighting point to answer this question about the relation between different autocratic or dictatorship of fascistoid regimes in the world, which we see now. But what I think is important to add on my side, first of all, I think that Iranian struggle is an example of a very brave and long-lasting resistance, because we know it's not the first time the Iranian society is protesting against it patriarchal and dictatorial and regime which represent support the authoritarian capitalist model of development. And I think this spiral of resistance which we are seeing now is also very inspiring for many people in the world, because we see how the continuation of struggle and experience of struggle goes on, and people are not giving up despite the repressions which are very harsh in Iranian society. And I also think that challenges to the regime which are opposed by the progressive resistance in Iran are very substantial. And yeah, of course, we also know that the repressions are very harsh. But I think that all in all, like people who are living and struggling against their own dictatorship as in Iran, or against foreign non-Western imperialist country as in Ukraine, we know perfectly well that opposing the existing for decades global and reactionary system we are living in now is not about supporting the competing dictatorship and imperialism, how we often see on the progressive side, so-called left or so-called progressive side of global movement, that it's not about whether it's good imperialism or bad imperialism, good dictatorship or bad dictatorship. It's all about any dictatorship or any imperialism. And I think what Iranian people are doing now, and the Iranian resistance is doing now, is and Ukraine and the Ukrainian society at the same time, is like what we can say, it's the challenge to that kind of multipolarity which many of on the left praise, that we are we are seeing the rise of the multipolar world, and that it's good to an extent it is, but what kind of multipolarity we want to see, like what polars of this multipolarity are good or bad, which are reactionary and so on. And I don't like what Iranian resistance and Ukrainian resistance, we are showing that we don't want this multipolarity to be a dictatorial multipolarity and a multipolarity of competing imperialism, because otherwise the world will end up in a disaster, and it's like very highly likely in the recent years, I think. So what I want to say in the end, that what I wish for Iranian resistance and Iranian society, like that, I just wish that people don't give up, and they, despite like a very harsh repression, I think it is very important, because we have seen what happens when a progressive resistance against dictatorial regime gives up, and that's what happened in Russia. So I think it's very important to continue, and I'm sure that, I mean, we have seen this struggle going on for more than 10 years in Iran, and I think it's very important and it's very inspiring that it continues.
Thank you so much, Oksana. اوکسانا تاکید میکنه که مبارزه مردمی داخل ایران و مقاومتی که ما شاهدش هستیم بسیار شجاعانه است، بسیار تحسین آمیزه و میدونه که این اولین باری نیست که مردم ایران دست به چنین مبارزه‌ای زدن، ولی در این حال فکر میکنه که تاثیر جهانیش بسیار زیاد بوده و خیلی الهام بخش بوده در سطح جهانی. خصوصا این که به نظر میاد که مقاومت از نوع بسیار ترقی خواهه. اون چیزی که مهم تشخیص بدیم اینه که مبارزات داخل ایران یا مبارزات مردم اوکراین علیه حمله نظامی روسیه به دنبال یک نوع دیکتاتوری دیگه یا یک نوع امپریالیسم دیگه نیستن، بلکه مخالف هر نوع استبداد و هر نوع امپریالیسمن و کلاً این مفهوم امپریالیسم چند قطبی رو اینجا دارن مطرح میکنن. ما در دنیای زندگی میکنیم که فقط یه قدرت امپریالیستی وجود نداره، بلکه قدرت‌های امپریالیستی چند قطبی داریم، یعنی هم امپریالیسم غربی رو داریم، هم روسیه رو داریم، هم چین رو داریم و پاسخی که ما در مبارزاتمون به این امپریالیسم چند قطبی میدیم برابر نیست با یه نوع دیگه استبداد. ما به دنبال جهانی هستیم که مبتنی بر رقابت و استبداد و ستم نباشه و من فقط امیدوارم که مردم ایران دست بر ندارن از مبارزهشون و ادامه بدن به این مبارزه، چون اگر دست بردارن از مبارزه شاهد شرایطی خواهیم بود که الان در روسیه مشاهده میکنیم، در آن پسرفت عظیم صورت گرفته و شرایط ایجاد کرده برای حمله نظامی که روسیه سال گذشته آغاز کرد در اوکراین. Thank you. So let me go to the next question. سوال سوم، کامران متین، استاد روابط بین الملل در انگلستان و نویسنده و روشنفکر کرد ایرانی، یکی از مدافعان حقانیت مبارزه اوکراینی ها برای حق تعیین سرنوشت خود بوده است. او در میزگردی که نشریه نقد اقتصاد سیاسی تحت عنوان بحران اوکراین در سایه جنگ سرد ارائه داد، تاکید کرده که بخش عمده چپ از تحلیل امپریالیسم غیرغربی عاجز است و حقانیت مبارزه اوکراینی ها برای حق تعیین سرنوشت و تاریخچه مبارزات آنها را نادیده می‌گیرد. از منظر او، راه پایان دادن به جنگ اوکراین همان راه حلی است که خود اوکراینی ها ارائه دادند: خروج بی‌قید و شرط ارتش روسیه از کل خاک اوکراین. متین میگوید که صحبت از مذاکره برای صلح در شرایطی که دو طرف چنین نابرابرند و یکی آشکارا قصد تصاحب کشور و نابودی مردم آن را دارد بی‌معنی است. لطفاً بیشتر در این مورد صحبت کنید. Now I will ask that question in English. Kamran Mateen, a Kurdish Iranian intellectual and professor of international relations in England, has been one of the supporters of the struggle of Ukrainians for self-determination. In a recent online webinar on the topic of, quote, the crisis in Ukraine in the shadow of a Cold War, unquote, organized by the journal Critique of Political Economy in Iran, he emphasized that the majority of the left has been incapable of analyzing non-Western imperialism. They have ignored the legitimacy of the Ukrainian struggle for self-determination and the history of their struggles. He has argued that the way to end the war in Ukraine is the solution that the Ukrainians themselves have offered. That is the full withdrawal of the Russian army from the entire territory of Ukraine without any conditions. Matin says that speaking of negotiating for peace is meaningless in a situation where the two sides are so unequal and one side openly wants to annex the other country and destroy its people. Please tell us more about this.
Thank you very much, Farida. It's a very important question, and it's a question that is now almost 9 years old, indeed. And these conversations have been ongoing since Russia annexed Crimea in 2014 in March. There is a lot of naivety and wishful thinking and denial in those arguments, because one thing that should be very clear, even to those who are not familiar much with history, that it's much more difficult to fight imperialism when you're under occupation. And indeed, these calls to peace are quite useless. There's been about 8 years of negotiations before the most recent invasion started last February. Indeed, Volodymyr Zelensky was going into elections in 2019 with that slogan of, trying to negotiate with Russia for a long-lasting peace and so on and so forth. That was seen by Putin as weakness, and the consequences of that we see now. Russia has no intention to negotiate. And there is a much more fundamental question. I think we need to, before even starting to talk about negotiations, we need to roll back a little. Why does anybody need to negotiate with somebody else who has illegally occupied their territory? That in itself is legitimizing the illegal invasion. There were agreements and promises that were not kept, that were broken. Somehow, some verbal promises to a president of non-existing country, i.e. Gorbachev in USSR, are being treated as more important than legal documents. There was Budapest Memorandum that these proponents of negotiations do not like to mention, that was signed between United States, Russia, United Kingdom and Ukraine, when Ukraine has been coaxed and tricked into giving up its nuclear arsenal and weapons of mass destruction arsenal in 1994. And those countries have promised to serve as guarantors of territorial integrity and security in the country. That has been broken. Russia has torn that apart. After that, in an attempt to stop the fighting in Donbass, Minsk agreements were signed first, and then the second version of them that tried to negotiate a ceasefire and some sort of conditions for what was hoped for would be a lasting peace. Those agreements were in violation of international law, and they were actually, legally speaking and discursively speaking, geopolitically speaking, quite damaging for the whole situation, because they functioned as a legitimation in an extent of the annexation of Crimea and of those proxy settler colonial republics, self-proclaimed republics in the east of the country. And that actually is something that could have been referred to as Russia launching a proxy war in Ukraine through those so-called republics, which were nothing of the kind. So with that in mind, there are certain some people, some political leaders, and some people on the self-declared international left have some vacuous moral contortions about NATO sending weapons to Ukraine. Well, according to the Budapest Memorandum, United States and United Kingdom are fulfilling their promises to support Ukraine. Germany, for example, still refuses to send tanks and comes into all sorts of twists discursively in order to not support Ukraine, claiming that it has a historic responsibility before Russia, even though it actually was Ukraine that Germany during the Second World War planned to turn into a colony and planned to turn Ukrainians into slaves. They need to maybe remember about historical responsibility before Ukrainians, before they think about responsibility before Russians, because the majority, they were not planning to occupy the majority of Russia, actually about 10 to 12% of it. So there is this conflation of USSR and Russia in the discourse of politicians, of historians, of political analysts, that ends up being a repetition of Kremlin talking points, of monopolizing the history of USSR, monopolizing any achievements that existed in USSR, while blaming Ukrainians and other peoples of Russian Federation for any flaws that existed in that system. And in that sense, we need solidarity internationally, and we need learning and understanding of what Russia is as in Russian Federation, but rather Russia, because those are not synonymous. And that Russia is a neo-colonial genocidal empire, from Crimean Tatars and Circassians to many peoples in its vast settler colony that has been eliminated in ethnic cleansing in order to build a country that holds most territory on the planet. Ukrainians now yet again, because it's not the first time that Russians have been exterminating them, are subject to this genocidal logic. And so talking about any negotiations with a country that declared an intention of genocide, which is a very unique thing, they are openly talking about the need to exterminate Ukrainian, an intention. Calling for Ukrainians to negotiate with this is extremely callous and inhumane. I'll stop here and I'll talk about 21st century imperialism after you translate.
Thank you. یولیا میگوید که گفتگو در مورد صلح با روسیه رو باید برگردونیم به آنچه که بعد از الحاق کریمه توسط روسیه، شبه جزیره کریمه توسط روسیه در سال 2014 انجام شد و همچنین تبدیل شرق اوکراین به اصطلاح جمهوری های مستقل ولی تحت کنترل روسیه، نه حتی جمهوری، دولت های مستقل تحت کنترل روسیه. اینجا ما با یک نوع ساده لوحی روبرویم. مبارزه با امپریالیسم هنگامی که کشورتون اشغال شده بسیار دشواره. اگر صحبت از مذاکره بر صلح میکنیم باید گفت که حتی قبل از حمله نظامی روسیه به حمله نظامی تمام عیار روسیه به اوکراین در فوریه 2022 زلنسکی آماده مذاکره بود ولی روسیه این رو به عنوان یک نوع ضعف از سوی اوکراین تلقی کرد. و اصلا چرا باید کشوری که توسط یک کشور دیگه با مقاصد امپریالیستی اشغال شده، چرا اصلا باید موظف باشه که مذاکره کنه برای صلح، در صورتی که روسیه اصلا قصد صلح نداره؟ در این حال توجه کنید به توافق بوداپست. Excuse me, Yulia, what year was the Budapest agreement?
1994.
توافق بوداپست در سال 1994 بین آمریکا، روسیه، انگلستان و اوکراین که اوکراین رو وادار کرد که بخشی از خاکش رو از دست بده، ببخشه. بعد در دو تا توافق مینسک رو داشتیم. And what years were the Minsk agreements?
I think the first one 2015 and then 2016. Please correct me, Oksana. I can't remember off the top of my head. Yeah.
بعد دو توافق مینسک رو داشتیم در سالهای 2015 و 2017 که مبتنی بر ایجاد یک نوع آتش بس بودند. ولی این توافقهای مینسک هر دو مغایرت داشتند با قوانین جهانی و در واقع الحاق کریمه و بخشی از شرق اوکراین توسط روسیه رو مجاز دونستن، بهش مشروعیت بخشیدن. متاسفانه بخشی از فعالان چپ بیشتر نگران اینن که ناتو به اوکراینیا اسلحه میده به جای اینکه نگران این باشن که اوکراینیا چطور میتونن مقاومت کنن علیه حمله نظامی روسیه. و حتی اگر از لحاظ قانونی هم بخوایم به این مسئله بپردازیم، بنابر توافق بوداپست در سال 1994 ناتو موظفه که به اوکراین اسلحه بده برای حمایت از خودش، برای مقاومت علیه حمله نظامی. آلمان در این زمینه بسیار کند عمل کرده و در این حال فراموش نکنیم که در جنگ جهانی دوم آلمان در زمان آلمان نازی یه بخشی از اوکراینی ها رو به بردگان خودش تبدیل کرد. در مجموع متاسفانه یه بخشی از چپ، یه بخش عمده چپ همون تبلیغات کرملین و دولت روسیه رو تکرار میکنه و اوکراینی ها رو ملامت میکنه بدون اینکه شرایط کنونی رو درک کنه و مطرح کنه. واقعیت امر اینه که روسیه یک دولت استعماریه که هدفش هدفش نسل کشیه و هدفش ایجاد امپراتوریه و مذاکره با چنین دولتی که آشکارا صحبت از نسل کشی و از بین بردن مردم اوکراین کرده هم بی‌مسئولیته و هم غیر انسانی. Thank you. Do you want to say anything else about this question?
Yes, just briefly. On the questions of imperialism, because we hear these criticisms about how United States are an empire and NATO backs up that empire, and therefore Ukraine shouldn't be helped because American imperialism need to be stopped. But we need to understand that we need to fight imperialism in the 21st century, on the 21st century imperialism terms, with its transnational imperialist structures and competing imperial powers and alliances. There can and there is more than one imperialism that can exist at the same time. There is no better or worse empires. All empires must fall. And for that also the empire of capital must fall, together with all its structures and the system of institutions, a dead bondage that keep power structures intact, regardless of who comes to power in various parts of it. But for Ukrainians, it is difficult to fight capitalism and imperialism while missiles fall on their heads, while millions of people are refugees and displaced, and while so many of them are on the front lines. The war must end first, and Ukraine must win, and Russian imperialism must be defeated. Because on top of that, because the foundational myth of Russian new empire does not work without Ukraine or Belarus as part of it, there are also, and thus part of that Russian defeat must include decolonization of Russian Federation, decolonization of Russia as in Russian Republic, but also the vassals of Russian imperialism in all territories of Russian Federation. How that shall work is up to the oppressed populations of Russian Federation constituent parts. It's paramount that it happens on the terms of those who are oppressed, and so that there isn't a repetition of certain structures that have been oppressing those people and extracting them for generations.
Thank you. در مورد امپریالیسم باید اذعان کنیم که در قرن 21 امپریالیسم قرن 21 رو باید بنابر شرایط 21 قرن 21 باید با اون بنابر شرایط قرن 21 جنگید و این امپریالیسم فراملیه. بیشتر از یک قدرت امپریالیستی در جهان وجود داره. همه امپریالیست ها رو باید نابود کرد. همه امپراتوری ها رو باید نابود کرد. خصوصا امپراتوری سرمایه که کل این نظام رو پایدار نگه داشته. اما برای اوکراینیا امکان پذیر نیست که در زمانی که مورد حمله موشک و پهپاد و حملات هوایی دیگر و تانک و حمله تمام عیار روسیه قرار گرفتن، در این حال با سرمایه‌داری هم مبارزه کنن. برای اینکه بتونیم با سرمایه‌داری مبارزه کنیم باید اول به این جنگ پایان بدیم، باید اول به حمله نظامی روسیه پایان بدیم و برای پایان دادن به جنگ و برای بیرون راندن روسیه باید از روسیه استعمار زدایی بشه و این کشورهایی که مستعمره روسیه بودن و مردمان اون کشورها هستند که باید شرایط رو تعیین کنن، باید تعیین کنن که این استعمار زدایی یعنی چی و تحت چه شرایطی به مقاومتشون میتونن پایان بدن. Thank you. Oksana, would you like to say anything?
Very briefly, I think Yulia made a very extensive and fundamental statements on the questions. I will also only add that for Ukrainian society, this kind of solutions with giving up on territories and agreeing to annexation, which was already done in 2014 in relation to Crimea Peninsula, it will not end the war. It will only postpone another phase of the war. Because we have no illusions that if Putin will remain in power and his regime will remain in power, it will only postpone another spiral of war for some years, which he will use or his regime will use to get more power and military power and to consolidate elites. There will be nothing good in it. And this solution with giving up territories to Russia will lead to even more fascist turn inside Russian society. It will basically, again, as I mentioned, it will consolidate elites in around Putin regime, and it will escalate repressions inside Russia, which are already in enormous scale. When people go to jail just for calling war, like calling it not a special military operation or war. So we will see another spiral of repression, and we will see another, in probably the second in the last 10 years, burned landscape of opposition in Russia. So they had it previously in 2012 when they had previous protests against the Putin regime, and these protests were heavily repressed. And basically now some kind of resistance is emerging. And if Russia, Putin regime, if it will win some part of Ukrainian territory, that will mean another spiral of repression, which again will destroy Russian opposition for years. So it will lead to even more dictatorial and authoritarian and fascist regime in Russia. It will probably also lead to many worrying tendencies in Ukraine also, both in terms of political circumstances or outcomes, demographic outcomes, and also economic outcomes. So basically, we have this ghost of Afghanistan out there, like with the war which was started by Soviet Union many like dozens years ago, and which turned the country into something like a ghost of a failed and prolonged war and military operation and multiple escalations and so on. And finally, as Julia also mentioned several times, it will lead and it will escalate basically the crisis of the global security system. It will not solve it in no way. It will only escalate this crisis and make the current security system, which is not far from perfect, and we see how it failed so many times, but it will mean also that this system will totally stop working, and there will be nothing progressive to replace there. It will lead again, as I mentioned, to a multipolar world where we will have a very regressive, conservative, and dictatorial alternatives to choose. And it's not the world the progressive forces are willing to see in the future.
Thank you so much. اوکسانا میگوید که اوکراین در سال 2014 یه بخشی از خاک خودش رو بخشید، یعنی شرق اوکراین و کریمه، ولی چنین کاری فقط باعث شد که جنگ بعدی به تعویق بیفته. بنابراین تسلیم شدن در برابر روسیه در شرایط کنونی و دادن بخش دیگری از خاک اوکراین به روسیه یا هیچ بخشی از خاک اوکراین به روسیه منجر به تقویت رژیم فاشیستی درون روسیه خواهد شد و سرکوب مقاومتی که درون روسیه در حال شکل گرفتنه، در صورتی که در حال حاضر شاهدیم که لااقل یک نوعی از مقاومت داره شکل میگیره درون روسیه. و پیروزی روسیه همچنین منجر به ادامه جنگ در اوکراین خواهد شد، یا لااقل گرایش‌های مختلف که به جنگ ادامه خواهند داد و با شرایطی مشابه افغانستان روبرو خواهیم شد که بعد از حمله نظامی روسیه چطور دیدیم که جناح‌های مختلف به جنگ با هم ادامه دادن و بعدش هم شاهد حمله نظامی آمریکا بودیم در سال 2003. بنابراین کلاً پیروزی روسیه بحران‌های جهانی رو تشدید خواهد کرد و باعث خواهد شد که یه نظام بسیار متشنجی داشته باشیم، هرج و مرج و بدون هیچ بدیل ترقی‌خواه. Thank you. Anything else you would like to say about this question before I go to the next one? Okay. سوال چهارم و سوال نهایی: اگر مقاومت مردم اوکراین پیروز شود و روسیه را از کل خاک اوکراین بیرون براند، این چه تبعاتی برای مبارزات عدالت‌خواهانه و مدافع حقوق زنان و اقلیت‌ها در منطقه و خاورمیانه خواهد داشت؟ And now in English, if the Ukrainian resistance succeeds and pushes Russia out of the entirety of Ukraine's territory, what effects do you think this will have on struggles for justice, women's rights, and minority rights in the region and the Middle East?
I can start here briefly. I won't say much here, but I think that first of all, like the failure of Russia to keep the annexed territories, occupied territories of Ukraine, first of all and foremost will mean the failure of Russia, of Putin regime, which I mean the political landscape of Russia is in such a way that if Putin will lose the war, like he cannot stay there in the country and he will be removed. That opens, first of all, the huge field for struggle for democratization and decolonization of Russia in a progressive sense. So it will open the field of struggle in Russia. It will have, I cannot say which, I'm not very optimistic about the field of, the landscape in Ukraine after the, if the war will end in such a way, but it will also release a huge amount of resources which people are spending now on struggling with humanitarian and military needs, and to go back to their like regular activities as feminist labor activists, LGBTIQ activists, and so on and so forth. Because what I see now and what is very worrying, but of course kind of natural, in a sense unavoidable, that all these people who have been struggling for labor rights and feminist issues and LGBTIQ issues and ethnic minorities issues, almost all of them are now preoccupied with struggling against the Russian invasion in multiple ways, either humanitarian or military. Of course, I'm not saying they are giving up on all the other questions, issues, and struggle. It's not true. They are continuing also this side of the activity, but of course the demanding tasks caused by Russian invasion, they are huge and they accumulate a lot of resources. So these people will have in the end their time and energy to invest in other topics. And as I think both me and Yulia were saying before, in terms of global landscape, the failure of Russian regime will probably lead to weakening of other authoritarian regime in a way that there will, as alliance between different non-Western authoritarian countries will become weaker. And also like it will be a kind of lesson, if you want, or window of opportunity also to think and to discuss what went wrong in this relation and what led to the events which we have been seeing in the recent years, and also to probably to some reconsideration of the global security system, which can function better, of course, and should be democratized in a way, because the model we have now is not that functioning. But again, it will probably lead to weakening of the dictatorial regime in the region. And I'm also meaning for example, right populist regimes in Hungary, or so it's not only about like Russia or about Middle East dictatorial regimes, it's far beyond that. So I think what is, in the end, it will open the field for multiple struggles, and the outcome of these struggles, they are not decided yet, but there will be a struggle, and it can be, if led by progressive forces, it can lead to a better and more sustainable development, both in Ukraine, in Russia, in the region, in Europe, and in Middle East, and so on.
Thank you. شکست روسیه به این معنا خواهد بود که رژیم پوتین سقوط خواهد کرد. یعنی شکست روسیه در جنگ به این معنا خواهد بود که رژیم پوتین سقوط خواهد کرد. چون اگر پوتین در این جنگ شکست بخوره به هیچ وجه نمیتونه بر مسند قدرت بمونه و این میدان رو باز میکنه برای مبارزات دموکراسی خواه هم در روسیه و در این حال در اوکراین اجازه میده که اون منابعی که طی سال گذشته و حتی پیش از اون هم ولی عمدتاً طی سال گذشته صرف جنگ میشده اختصاص داده بشه دوباره به نیازهای مردم و فعالان کارگری، فمینیست، دیگرباشان جنسی، فعالان مدافع حقوق اقلیت‌های ملی و قومی بتونن به مبارزاتشون ادامه بدن بدون اینکه دل مشغولی اصلیشون جنگ باشه. و در سطح جهانی شکست روسیه به معنای تضعیف دیگر رژیم‌های اقتدارگرا خواهد بود در خاورمیانه، در اروپای شرقی، در کل جهان. انگار که پنجره‌ای باز میشه به روی بازاندیشی بدیل‌های ترقیخواه، اجازه میده به نیروهای ترقیخواه که به مبارزه‌شون ادامه بدن و مسئله امنیت جهانی رو هم به یه نوع دیگه به بحث میکشه یا اجازه میده که مسئله امنیت جهانی به نوع دیگه مطرح بشه. Anything else you'd like to say, Oksana, before we go to Yulia on this question? Thank you. Yulia.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Oksana, for the excellent comment as well. Indeed, I agree with you completely that the weakening, the fall of Putin's regime and the weakening of the authoritarian neo-fascist alliance that we see internationally is a benefit for all. First of all, to people who live under Putin's regime, but also benefit to Iranians. The authoritarian regime of who is benefiting from ties with Putin. It's a benefit to Syrians who will lose support when Assad's regime loses support of Putin. It's a benefit to all people, all the populations around the world who are suffering directly or indirectly. That legal precedent. The precedent of the fall of Putin's regime and international cooperation in helping to make that regime fall, and slapping him on the wrist and bringing that regime to justice is something that is utterly needed, and it indeed opens a possibility for an international dialogue about crimes against humanity, about ecocide, about breaking of international laws and agreements. There will be a lot of learning that will need to happen for legislators, for institution functionaries, and again, this window of opportunity through which an international system will be transformed in a way that I will describe in a minute. But one of the things that I think is also very important for those who are engaged in struggles for justice, women's rights and minority rights in the region and in Middle East and elsewhere, is that we will need to build on this historic opportunity, horrendous but yet opportunity, to build from the to build solidarities around the solutions and proposals for reconstruction of Ukraine. On international cooperation and funding of that reconstruction, and built stronger campaigns around cancellation of crippling debt internationally for Ukraine and not only, for compensation for ecocide, and for compensation of destruction of infrastructure and livelihoods. That is what will need to happen. And I think this historic opportunity cannot be missed. As we need to be building campaigns around transformation of the international security system, about horizontalization of global security order under the UN umbrella. And we also need to be designing the left answer to international security conundrum. Some of the most vile criticism that were coming at Ukraine around getting weapons from NATO countries have, of course, sounded ridiculous, because where else is Ukraine supposed to get support? But at the same time, we need to have an answer to international security guarantees from the left. As long as we do not have that answer, we will keep having countries fall as prey to these various powers with too much ambition. And for that, of course, horizontalization of international security order needs to happen, and transformation of the UN security order. And permanent Security Council must be abandoned, as well as veto power. And no aggressors should ever again have a right to vote on the destiny of those whose rights they are violating. That is an absolute must. We need different economic systems, because the root of a lot of conflicts lie in economic systems, and a lot of injustice sits in how economic systems work. We need different systems that will establish historical justice for ecocide, hunger, extractivism, and oppression of various minorities and women around the world. Without those, a lasting international peace cannot be possible. And indeed, talking about minorities is a bit disingenuous, because a lot of peoples who are called minorities are in fact majorities, but that's sort of the language of international institutions, if you like. If that international justice, including climate justice, is not established, wars will taint our history long into the future. And so we can be building solidarities on principles of intersectionality, meaningful, transforming, building a different economic system with a proper functioning of the state, internalization of negative and positive externalities into economic models. Still, under international financing and aid systems, public spending on education, on healthcare, on childcare are seen as wasted money. That is a wrong approach. The positive externalities of those expenditures are indisputable, even for the most hard-nosed neoclassical economists. That needs to be included, as much as ecocidal negative externalities of fossil fuel industries and other environmentally destructive industries. Once that balancing, once that inclusive vision of what economic activity is and for what purposes it is, meaning it needs to be built to preserve human and other types of life on this planet and provide to have thriving communities. Until that is established, these balances will keep existing. I understand these are very big challenges that we have before us, but without that, people around the world, no life on Earth will be able to survive. As pompous as it may sound, that is a reality that we live in. But I believe that through solidarity and cooperation, and through using this horrible historic moment as an opportunity to build bridges rather than start fighting amongst each other, we can really build transformative international politics. I will stop here.
Thank you. سقوط رژیم پوتین و تضعیف قدرت‌های اقتدارگرا در سطح جهانی به تمام مردم جهان کمک خواهد کرد. خصوصا ایرانیا و سوری ها و هر کسی که از این تبعات اقتدارگرایی در روسیه به صورت مستقیم یا غیر مستقیم رنج میبره. ما احتیاج به همبستگی و همکاری جهانی برای برقراری عدالت داریم. باید روسیه رو بابت جنایتاش علیه بشریت، نابودی محیط زیست و نقض قانون مجازات کنیم. باید از این فرصت استثنایی تاریخی استفاده کنیم که همبستگی ایجاد کنیم، نه فقط برای بازسازی اوکراین بعد از شکست روسیه و باطل کردن وامی که اوکراین الان بر دوش داره، بلکه ایجاد کارزارهای مبتنی بر نوع جدیدی از امنیت جهانی که در وهله اول مستلزم این است که چیزی به نام شورای امنیت سازمان ملل با حق وتو وجود نداشته باشه. یعنی ما در شرایطی هستیم فعلا که یه دولت امپریالیست متجاوز میتونه رأی بده و وتو کنه تصمیمی رو که بر زندگی قربانیانش تأثیر میذاره. اگر که قصد داریم به ناتو انتقاد کنیم، به جای اینکه انتقاد کنیم به مردم اوکراین که چرا از ناتو اسلحه میگیرن برای اینکه با حمله نظامی روسیه مقابله کنن، باید مسئله امنیت جهانی و بین المللی رو مطرح کنیم. با ستم سرمایه، ستم علیه اقلیت‌های ملی و قومی، حمله به محیط زیست، نابودی محیط زیست مقابله کنیم. مسئله عدالت زیست محیطی رو مطرح کنیم و بر اساس اصول مبتنی بر درکی از در هم تنیدگی این ستم‌ها یک نظام اقتصادی جدید ایجاد کنیم. مسئله آموزش پرورش، بهداشت، پایان دادن به استفاده از سوخت‌های فسیلی، اینا همه باید اولویت‌های ما باشه. و اگر به این مشکلات نپردازیم، بحران‌ها شدیدتر خواهد شد و هیچ نوع زندگی نمیتونه در کره زمین ادامه پیدا کنه. اما اگر شرایط کنونی رو به عنوان یه فرصتی برای همبستگی و همکاری جهانی ببینیم، میتونیم پیوندهای جدیدی ایجاد کنیم که منجر به دگرگونی سیستم سیاسی و اقتصادی جهانی خواهد شد. Anything else that either of you would like to say about that question? No. Okay. So I would like to thank our speakers, Oksana Duchak and Yulia Yurchenko. I would like to thank Zamane for producing this program. And I hope that viewers contact our speakers or Zamane if they would like to have further conversations about this issue. And در پایان مایلم از بینندگان تشکر کنم، از زمانه، از تهیه کنندگان برنامه بابت این فرصتی که در اختیار ما قرار دادن برای این بحث بسیار ارزشمند. و اگر کسی مایل باشه با سخنرانان تماس بگیره، هر دو اطلاعاتشون در اینترنت موجوده و امیدوارم که بتونیم به این بحث ادامه بدیم، چون در واقع مسئله مرگ و زندگی مردم اوکراین، ایران و مسائل بسیار اساسی جهانی اینجا مطرح شد، از چشمانداز فمینیستی و از چشمانداز انسان باور. یک دنیا متشکرم. روزتون، شبتون بخیر.
Thanks to Frida, Yulia and Oksana for this great conversation. و با تشکر از شما که در این عصر چهارشنبه همراه ما بودید. ما در تلاشیم این وبینارها را با فمینیست‌های دیگر کشورها از جمله روسیه و چین هم ادامه بدیم. تاریخ وبینارهای بعدی از طریق سایت و شبکه‌های اجتماعی اعلام میشه و البته برنامه ضبط شده این وبینار که شاهدش بودید اگر میخواین برای دوستانتون بفرستین در همه پلتفرم ها هست و در 24 ساعت آینده در اینستاگرام هم خواهد بود. عصر خوش.